we thought about who we needed to hear from for our hashtag community care series. We knew we needed to reach out to you to find out what it is that you're working on, and things that we could be doing to support each other right now. So on that note, Eddy, tell us who you are.
I'm the founder and president of the New Bread Foundation, which is a fairly new foundation to really trying to create a seat at the philanthropy table to be able to empower marginalized Asian American and Pacific Islander populations. And
you've been really instrumental in cross-cultural solidarity work. And you've also been extremely fundamental and active on issues of anti-Asian violence now under COVID, but way before then. And so I'd love for you to kind of, tell our folks who are listening, what have you been doing? What have you been seeing around anti-Asian violence? And
so the reemergence of this attack, right, on the Asian and Chinese Americans, and as a result of the COVID-19, it really impacts our community in a way that it represents exactly what the system of oppression or the white supremacy is designed to do under this capitalistic system, right, that we're living in. And I'm saying that because on the level of the attacks where we have witnessed, right, thousands of attacks, like nationally, that's happening, right? So as a matter of fact, today, the Chinese for Affirmative Action is going to do a report, right, on all the data that Dr. Russell Zheng from San Francisco State University has collected, to really kind of do a landscape analysis of all this impact, right, all the incidents that happen, all the impact in our community, and then on a larger community as a whole, right? So the attacks locally, we can see the steady increase of that attack locally, and then on a national level, everyone.
I appreciate you giving the like on the grounds kind of anti-Asian violence, but I also know, I'm looking at that shirt that you're wearing, right? So there's this One Nation campaign that has existed for, a number of years, because we know that Asians and Pacific Islanders and other immigrant communities have been denied access to healthcare. I've been thinking about that as a type of anti-Asian violence as well. So I would love for you, to also tell us a little bit more about that level of violence.
Definitely, when we're talking about on that level, on the systemic level, we talk about the public charge, right, that's being pushed down by this administration that really disempower immigrants or residents in this country, right, they're trying to separate people from whether you're a citizen or non-citizens, right? Whether you're a good immigrant or a bad immigrant, or where you are, so all this separation of what is good and what is bad, and use that as a scapegoat to push down policy to continue to disempower our people and to continue to kind of assert violence in our community, right? And that sort of violence is exactly what you're talking about, is that physical violence, through policies, physical violence through, incarceration, deportation, and then those mental violence of this daily stress about how you're able to stay healthy as a family, right, and the basic needs. And so we see this happening all the time in immigrant populations, right? For whether it's for Asian American Pacific Islander population, or for Black refugees, or for other immigrants, So we're all in the same boat together, essentially, right? So when we look at COVID-19 about some of the violence that is inflicted on the Asian American and Chinese American community, people has a tendency of not understanding that this is the divide and conquer methods that continues to be utilized, right, by the system in a way to continue to separate us, continue to create this type of tension. So then there's control in that way, right? So when we look at the challenges of the API population, I cannot help but connect it with the challenges the most vulnerable population in the African American community, right? So it is definitely, been reported that the larger percent of the people that who are really impacted by the COVID-19, which has been sentenced to life sentence when it comes to dealing with mass incarceration in the prison industrial complex, and as well as in poverty-stricken and violence-stricken areas, right? So we're living in a bubble in the Bay Area because, as we know, in the Bay Area, especially in San Francisco, the African-American population is like almost to the point that because of gentrification and displacement is almost to a point that's like about 4%, right? So then the impact, is definitely higher, right, when it comes to the impact. But when you look at other part of the country where there's overwhelming population of African Americans that don't have health care, that continues to have redlining, have all these oppressive policies being pushed down on them, and the anti-Blackness sentiment that is also part of the challenges to create those type of tensions and create some of those attacks, then we neglect to really understand that how important it is for us to be able to identify those type of challenges in each of our community and really realize that the only solution is to come together.
Well, I appreciate you saying that because, the other thing is that, we know as they disaggregate the data around COVID that Black communities are being disproportionately impacted in terms of infections and deaths, right? So we have statistics from Chicago, Milwaukee, where, and in St. Louis came out more recently where all the deaths as a result of COVID have been of Black communities, right? Black people. And then, new research just came out too around Native communities being most susceptible, like we're having the Navajo communities are also being impacted disproportionately and having everything to do with lack of access to healthcare, underlying health disparities and issues, redlining, So I really appreciate you saying that COVID is impacting our different communities. And then here we have Asians in particular who are being attacked, right? So under COVID, it's exacerbating all of these racial these forms of racial violence and racial inequities. So I appreciate you contextualizing for us, and I also want folks to understand, you mentioned the need for us to come together. So tell us, what are the ways that people are building racial solidarity and working alongside one another for this kind of culture and politics?
Well, for me, it's definitely, I look at what Yuri has done with her life, how her global analysis of how do we deepen each other's relationships, how do we cross borders, right? How do we decolonize our minds, and the importance of the demonstration of reaching across different racial ethnic groups, right? To talk about how do we support each other to fight against injustice, right, in each other's community, right? The examples of Grace Lee Bogg, right? Even with Rich Aoki, right? And then with so many other people who really connected the community together, right? To saying that, hey, this is what my experience has been, and this is how I want to reach out to them because I see the commonalities of those type of struggles, right? And I think so. So that's key.
Well, you as an example, right? So we can look at our historic figures. I think you have been really instrumental. And I bring that up because I know that on the grounds, our communities are also working alongside each other, and they may not have become these icons, but like on the streets, people are trying to take care of each other as well. And so I think you lead by example from all the work you've been doing for most of your life, and especially out here in these streets. I kind of want to emphasize that, right?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, right? So I'm trying to kind of put that in the context and make that connection in a way that, even when I was incarcerated, right, that's the education that I was able to cultivate for myself, right, through my engagement of the community and the progressive leaders and elders and ancestors. When I returned to the free world, in a sense, I immersed myself in building that racial solidarity, right? So at one point, it's not just about, just kind of taking care of my community and supporting my community, but really because of my experience when I was incarcerated, I was able to connect with all other ethnic groups, even though we are segregated by race inside the prison system. But I was able to really defy that, right? So I challenged that, the segregation, was able to build a meaningful relationship. And I took the same value out here to the streets, where I'm able to connect with different communities and working with different communities, right, in San Francisco.
You talk about the racial solidarity that you cultivated inside San Quentin through those years. It wasn't just like buddy, let's be friends. You all organized inside and suffered some serious consequences around that. And maybe one day we'll host like an entire episode on that. But I would love for you to share maybe briefly, or actually not, just tell us, what did it mean to organize inside for racial solidarity when it was state sanctioned segregation inside, and how that led you? Actually, just leave it there, because racial solidarity to me is going to be a lot of hard work, right? So I just want you to tell that story if you can.
Yeah. All right. So for me, definitely, while I was incarcerated, right, we are forced to really live in close quarters, right, in this prison that we are confined in. Right? Whatever prisons that we go to, we get confined to just that space. However, the prison is a microcosm of society, right? So because we are in a small quarters, we're forced to have to live with each other and survive together. Then we have a choice. How do we live inside? Even though the administration is doing very hard to segregate all of us, right, to be able to contain us and control us, then because I was able to really understanding the importance of building relationships and connecting with other people, then I was able to really reach out to individual and humanize them as an individual, because I wanted to do the same to me, right? So, and then as part of the building that kind of racial solidarity within the prison system and organizing, it's there are different ways. For us, breaking bread is one of those things that creates racial solidarity, right? So we would be sharing food with each other, right? So some of the food, like I always remember the story about the fried days, right? Fried days is a black bean fried days is a canned good that, it's a fried fish. And then, so all the Asian, we eat it, right? Because this is our diet, at home, and we come in. So when we start getting the, packages, and we start sharing it with our African-American partners and, even the whites and the Latins, everybody's like, we'll connect with each other and talk about each other. So whenever there's issues on the yard and there's conflicts that's happening, we're able to resolve that, right? Because we have the relationship with different people who are in different groups that we can talk with, right? Instead of resorting to violence, that we're able to really come to terms to have some sort of kind of like a mediation, because the relationship we were able to build. Change the landscape of prison organizing in some ways is that, when we fought for the NX studies, right, inside the San Quentin State Prison, where we're able to really trying to challenge, even within the prison system, how are we going to be able to really empower ourselves by having more well-rounded and more diverse curriculums, right? So we can learn more and not be ethnocentric about what just one aspect of the history, or what the required general requirement for you to get an associate of arts degree or a bachelor's degree, right? But really trying to expand the mindset of individuals.
What I love about what you're saying and what you're emphasizing is building community has always been kind of the fundamentals around this work. So building relationships with each other is so important, and seeing each other, right, around cross-cultural, racial solidarity, inter-community, intra-community. It's about building relationships. So I hear you saying that. And then I also hear you saying stuff about, politics, organizing together. So building community and organizing together was a part of the racial solidarity.
The importance of, how do we deepen that relationship? How do we introduce each other to different culture practices, right? The healing, the family, So I remember, so like I mentioned to you about in the penitentiary, how we break bread and share food, share cultural food, like this is how we build relationship inside and to connect with each other inside, right? So on the street, it's the same way. I just remember out in the Bayview, we started the Bayview Youth Advocates program, right? Where really it's a multicultural youth leadership program to be able to empower young people so they can help lead us to change the dominant narrative, right? Change the way that the system already been conditioning us. We want those young people to be able to learn and grow and start taking leadership, right? It's building that leadership pipeline. So as a result of some of the violent incidents that happened, in the community, we were able to respond by having annual events, right, to celebrate Black history, and coupled it with celebration of the Lunar Year. Right? So it's not something that you just out of the blue because it's a celebration, we all come together, but really it's building that continuously, 365 days a year, right? So that's the same thing when we were in the Asian Prison Support Committee, even though we center around how do we support the marginalized AAPI who are currently and formerly incarcerated. But in the meantime, most of the people that we were incarcerated with is overly, majority is African American, right? So we have those connection with them on the inside. When we come out on the street, we still have the same connection. So we are very intentional about building solidarity with African American organizations, right? And the same thing is being done, when we see how Alicia Garza from Black Lives Matter showing up for our community. We see different folks that really out in the front line trying to saying that we need to support our AAPI issues and the movement, right, in some way, just like they show up for the API for Asian for Black Lives Matters, right? And other, there's so many other historical kind of like narration and event that happened that we see in the cross-cultural solidarity work that is embedded with the Asian Americans and the African American community, right? But those are not being put into the textbooks. Those are not being blasted out in social media. Those are not the things that people see, right? Because unfortunately, that there's still those type of work, is just like more grassroots, right? And not like a systemic or not institutionalized as the or the other things being institutionalized. It's how do we validate the people who are victimized and traumatized by those type of attacks, right? That's the important piece. Like we can say like, oh, we want to have criminal justice reform. We want to have all these different ways to challenge the policy that's criminalize the people of color. But how do we center the victims, the survivors? And I think that's where AAPI Women League stood up and say that, as we are supporting this, as all this is happening on the national level, the AAPI population, whether you identify as a woman or LGBTQ, gender non-conforming or disability, how do we center that? Because there's a whole different cultural competency people need to learn to really understand the different sets of challenges, right? And so that's why we need that in place, and that's why Connie Wun and yourself are leading that effort in that space to create those type of space. And that's why I'm grateful to be a part in this as an ally, right? Being targeted, right? We've been knowing how it feels being targeted. If you look at history, and that's what history has shown us, right? We're all being targeted, period. Right. It's just it's different eras.
Remember the history of violence against Asians across the globe and then here in the United States, and you are reminding us around, you're helping us to think through the context. So the Chinese Exclusion Act, the, Japanese internment camps, the poverty and deportation of Southeast Asians, the racism against Filipinos, poverty, generally speaking, across our diasporas. And then, you're helping us to think through our relationship to anti-Blackness is really important in terms of how some of our communities have embodied some of it and subscribed to it. And when I think, when we get challenged to be accountable to our own anti-Blackness, I think that's going to be important for racial solidarity, right? Because as many of our friends, you and I have similar friends and colleagues, some of them have said things like anti-Blackness is like the air we breathe. So what does it mean that right now under this coronavirus, that there's this anti-Blackness as the air we breathe, and then the threat of coronavirus as a part of the air we breathe, right? Both seem to be something we need to be attentive and vigilant towards, and not breathe that air in. It sounds like that's the work you've been doing. I'm also, as we wrap up, I want us to think, what can other people do in terms of helping to fight anti-Asian violence and to build racial solidarity? If you
Right? So what we can do out here is how do we support each other's community? I mean, I think the second thing is like, I think the best thing to do is how are we going to be able to speak up, right, against violence towards any community. We have been allies. So how do we amplify and continue to invest in that and support each other? You know?
That is a great way to end the conversation, and essentially kind of a call to action for us to have each other's backs, to be in community, and to amplify the ways that we've been in community with each other. So as always, Eddy, you are one of the most amazing human beings in this freaking universe, let alone one of our most important political, social figures, and one of our greatest caretakers. So I want to thank you for spending the time sharing all this knowledge and helping to lead the way to end the violence against Asians and towards racial solidarity. Thanks, Eddy, so much, and we'll see you later.
Thank you, Connie.